This lecture was created in some way to bring recognition to the Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences program here at NC State, and also to bring world-renowned scientists, conservationists into the classroom to interact with our students. And I'm sure our guest lecturer can attest that she's interacted with quite a number of students while she's been here. So the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program is a program that's actually shared amongst a variety of different colleges on campus: the College of Ag and Life Sciences, the College of Veterinary Medicine, and the College of Natural Resources. And I want to thank the support of the College of Natural Resources for helping put this on this year. I also want to thank the graduate students in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program, because the graduate students helped organize the selection process. They chose the lecture, and they actually invited Dr. Turner to come here. And I especially want to shout out to Shiloh Felton. So Shiloh's done a lot to really make this go this year. So thank you, Shiloh. So now I'm going to allow the Dean of the College of Natural Resources to come up and say a few words. Dean Watson.
I'm so glad they allowed me to say a few words. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for coming to this event. You know, this event is one I've come to look forward to every year. It's such a pleasure to see Fred Barkalow's daughter, Joanne, and her husband, Donald, who have become good friends of mine. And Joanne is going to come up in a minute and share a few words for you. But I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how important an endowed lecture series like this is. You know, we couldn't do this without the good support of our friends of the College of Natural Resources, and we've invited some of them back to join us this evening. This lecture series brings a premier scientist to campus, and that wonderful person this year, Dr. Turner, in a minute will come up here and you'll see, but she gets to interact with our students and show them some really exciting things that they haven't seen before, and to share both her personal story of how she got to her career, but also the excitement of the discovery of being a landscape ecologist, how she works with her students, and to encourage our students to think big as they do their work. But my hope is when she goes home, she also says, you know, there are awesome people at NC State doing incredible things, that having a lecture series like this is also a way to take our great work out to the larger community and let the world know some of the good things that we're doing. So we're hoping to have more and more of these as the years go by, to bring folks to campus who represent the diversity of the things the College of Natural Resources is all about. Let me just check my cheat sheets here. My staff know I'll say whatever I want anyway. Anyway, it's not my intention to hog all of Monica's time by prattling on up here, but I just wanted to share for a few minutes how important this kind of lecture series is to our college. But it is now my very great pleasure for you to hear from Fred Barkalow's daughter, Joanne, a little bit about her passion for wildlife and conservation biology. And I would invite Joanne to come forward. And, well, Joanna, I'm sorry. All right.
We had the great pleasure of going out to dinner with Dean Watson. I think it was the second night that you arrived in Raleigh, and what a pleasure. I want to thank each of you, and especially my husband Donald, for spending this afternoon with Dr. Monica Turner, our 2017 speaker for the Barkalow Distinguished Conservationist Lecture. I am so grateful for the hard work of Dr. Chris Moorman and the staff and graduate students in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program for preparing my parents' lecture and for continuing my father's 1980 vision for this program. When I was thinking about what I would say today, I remembered the very wise words of our extraordinary College of Natural Resources Dean Mary Watson. reeling from them, that's putting it mildly, reeling from the results of the 2016 presidential election and worrying about our environment's future. Dean Watson emailed me, quote, "We will just have to work harder." So I thought about her words and what my father would do today. And I found my answer in one of the newspaper editorials written after his death. Quote, "He had a strong awareness of the cost and benefits of the connection between conservation and conservatism in the sense of safeguarding and reinvesting the riches nature has given us in trust." The editorial continues, "A keynote in that career was balance, in biology and in politics. Barkalow was concerned with balanced multiple uses for forest, population balance for wildlife, a balance of benefits from conservation. A last major contribution to North Carolina involved political balance of power, when Barkalow filed with fellow conservationists the successful 1981 lawsuits over legislative appointments to the commissions that helped halt a growing tilt toward too much legislative clout." The editorial concludes, "In and out of the classroom, he lived a committed, engaged life, far from the ivory tower metaphor. He used his academic freedom to make his state a better place to live." So yes, Dean Watson, today, and as my father did before, we just have to work harder to achieve and sustain the balance in biology and the politics that we all value. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, Dean Watson. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Donald, for y'all's support. So now I have the pleasure to introduce our Barkalow Lecture today. Dr. Monica Turner is the Eugene P. Odum Professor of Ecology and the Vilas Research Professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research emphasizes causes and consequences of spatial heterogeneity in ecological systems, focusing primarily on ecosystem and landscape ecology. You'll hear today about her research in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, studying fire, vegetation dynamics, nutrient cycling, and the likes. She also studies abrupt change in ecological systems, land and water interactions in Wisconsin landscapes, and spatial dynamics and ecosystem services. She's published over 250 papers, authored or edited 6 books, including the foundation book in landscape ecology. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Fordham University and her PhD in Ecology from the University of Georgia. So we have that in common, of course. She also is a recent past president of the Ecological Society of America, a recipient of the Society's Robert H. MacArthur Award, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Monica, thanks.
Thanks, Joanna, and to your family for the opportunity it provides to me and others like me to come and visit here. And thanks to everyone for the hospitality for the past day or two. It's really been fun. So I'm going to launch right in by starting and just saying I'm up here speaking today, but I'm giving a perspective on many, many years of work. And I would just like to, at the outset, acknowledge I have many students and collaborators and funding sources that have contributed to this over the years. So national parks are some of our highest valued national treasures. These are places where we've preserved unique elements of our landscapes and of our cultural heritage. As many of you know, when you go to visit a national park, you're looking for beautiful scenery like Yellowstone Lake or geysers like we have in Yellowstone, or the wildlife, or all the beautiful things that we see when we enjoy and that we enjoy when we're out there. So when we see scenes like this is a little bit different than the way we think about national parks and the way we think about beauty and the way we think about ecological systems. This is Yellowstone during the summer of 1988. These are photos from the famous or infamous, depending on how you think of it, 1988 Yellowstone fires. When those fires ended, this is what the landscape looked like. And these are color photos, they're not black and white. But it looked like everything was gone. So how does this jive with our understanding of national parks and of the dynamics that we would expect? So our understanding about natural dynamics in our parks and our wildernesses, as much as any other places, has evolved over time. I think about it from the perspective of the way we think about our national parks and the way we think about our ecological systems. And there's just a little timeline here with a couple of the key reports that have talked about the role of parks. So from the Leopold report in the 60s that said a national park should present a vignette of primitive America, kind of a static view, and we had a very equilibrium, balance of nature perspective and ecology. Through the 80s and 90s, as we understood that disturbances were important and that systems changed, realizing that we can't conserve our ecosystems in a static way, that they have to change. And I would argue, and as I'm thinking, you'll see towards the end of my talk today, where we're now thinking about how do we steward these places in a time period when we expect continuous change that we don't yet fully understand and don't know how to anticipate. So I would argue that national parks, as places where we can watch nature work and learn from how nature behaves, are also amongst our scientific treasures. And I hope I'll convince you of that if you don't believe me by the end of my talk today. But they're among our best living laboratories for understanding environmental change with minimal impact of humans. And they've provided new understanding of natural disturbance dynamics, which I'll show you today, and I hope insights into future forest resilience. So I'm going to take you on a trip to Greater Yellowstone for the rest of this afternoon. So we're leaving North Carolina. Greater Yellowstone is centered on Yellowstone National Park. That's the middle area here. I don't know if I can reach that kind of way. Surrounded by wilderness areas, national forests, and the like. It's one of the largest intact temperate landscapes in the world, and it's the largest that we have in the lower 48 states. Most of Yellowstone is forested, and the dominant forest types are illustrated here. The high elevations have spruce and fir forests, that's where it's cooler and moister. Lodgepole pine dominates the middle elevations, and that's the dominant tree within Yellowstone National Park. So about 80% of Yellowstone is forested, 80% of the forests are lodgepole pine. And then the lower tree line grades into aspens and also Douglas fir, and those are the positions that are lower tree line is warmer and drier in the Rocky Mountains. Now, fire is not new in this landscape, and I have found it kind of fun to read through some of the early accounts of the explorers who were surveying and reporting back on Yellowstone. So there's a fire that's mentioned from one of the, Nathan Langford, he was the first superintendent of Yellowstone from the Washburn expedition, talking about breaking camp and traveling along the Firehole River, and passing thence through a long stretch of fallen timber, blackened by fire for about 4 miles. This, based on the tree ring analyses that my colleague Bill Rami has done, was likely a fire that burned in 1862, so just 8 years before they were traveling, and the evidence of that is in their journals. We also know a lot from both dendro studies and paleo studies, where you look at cores from lakes. And so we now know that infrequent stand replacing, so high severity fires that kill the trees, those kinds of fires are business as usual in Yellowstone and also in many of the northern Rocky Mountain landscapes, including western Montana, where we had a lot of fires this summer. The fire return interval throughout the Holocene, so since the Ice Age ended over the last 10,000 years, is about every 100 to 300 years. And this fire regime has been limited by climate. And when I say limited by climate, what I mean is that there's pretty much always plenty of fuel. It's not the same as the southeastern longleaf pine systems, but most summers are too wet and too cool for fire to burn. So it's only when you get those really extreme conditions that everything can take off. And that's actually very consistent with the fires that we see in California this week as well. Those are fire-adapted systems burning under Santa Ana winds. So even with that, the 1988 fires were pretty massive. Those of you, I know if there were students here, you might not have been born at the 1988 fires. It's kind of a depressing thing when I talk about them these days. But they were on the news all summer that summer, and everyone thought Yellowstone was destroyed. They've also been referred to as the fires that kind of ushered in this new normal of increased fire throughout the West. And so the size and the severity of those fires surprised both the science and the management community. So this picture in red shows you the outline of the 1988 fires. They covered about a third of Yellowstone National Park, and they also went through some of the surrounding areas. They burned under very severe drought, the lowest fuel moisture conditions that had been recorded since they've been tracking it. High winds, 60 mile an hour, very much like what we've heard about on the news for California this week. And they were not caused by past fire suppression. I always try to emphasize that in this system because that's different from the southwestern forest where you're in ponderosa pine, where fire suppression in many places has fundamentally changed fire dynamics. In Yellowstone, that's not the case. But they also gave us an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of a big disturbance. As a landscape ecologist, this is an opportunity because we don't get to do this experimentally. So this is me in the fall of 1988. I realized I was exactly half the age that I am now, so you can figure that out. I got to fly up in a helicopter during the end of the firefighting season. So this was still with fire suppression money. I'd never been in a helicopter before. It was actually kind of fun. But that's what we got to see. And so the fires, even though I showed you those big blocks of red, you know, where you can see it looks like it might have been a moonscape, it's not a moonscape. They're very complex patterns that are created. So this, we say it's a mosaic. There's areas where the black in the center, and I'm sorry, I'm only going to point to one side. Right? The black in the center is where the fires were most severe, so the trees were killed and the needles are consumed. They're ringed by areas of brown. That's where the trees were also killed, but the needles and the cones were not consumed by the flames. And then there's lots of areas in green that are unburned, unaffected by the fires. So at this point, this is not a surprise anymore. It was a surprise back in 1988. We didn't know they were going to be this complex spatially. We really did think it was going to be much more of a moonscape than it was. And this heterogeneity is important for the revegetation and for many other processes. As we have studied these fires, the vegetation recovered really quickly, and again, faster than we expected. If I go back to the hypotheses in the first NSF proposal that funded this, we were surprised by what we found. If we see pictures from October of 1988, and then in 1989, this is a little baby lodgepole pine seedling. The tree seedlings come in and they establish the first year right after the fire. The understory vegetation also recovered very quickly. This is 2 years after the fire. And then by 15 years after the fire, we have a thriving, young, regrowing forest. So that was pretty fast for that system. One of the mechanisms underpinning this is that even though the fires are big and severe and they kill all the trees, they do not burn deeply into the soil. And we did not know that. I mean, again, I feel like it's kind of staying obvious now. The fires blow through pretty quickly. And so many of the roots and the rhizomes survived and then they resprouted. So on the top panel, these are some that we excavated, and you can see this lupin is attached to a very old, well-developed root. So in those places that looked black right after the fire came through, there was a lot of resprouting native species. They then flowered, set seed, and filled in. So succession was autogenic. That is, it came from the natural species. And we've also tracked invasive species. We expected, based on disturbance and what we see in other places, to see non-natives. That didn't happen. Another surprise, I told the students this morning my story about this because we misidentified the plant in the first year because it's not supposed to be there. We were all told that aspen had not reproduced by seed since the end of the Ice Age in the northern Rocky Mountains. It's all clonal. And so the first year we had lots of unidentified green things. It was one of them. We thought it was maybe a goldenrod or something like that, and it was woody the next year. And it was aspen, and they were reproducing by seed. Again, unexpected based on conventional wisdom. We have aspen groves at the lower elevations. This is a little seedling aspen. And then standing right here, this is one of my colleagues. This is an aspen in, I think, 2008, I think it is. So things grow slowly in Yellowstone compared to the Carolinas or the Southeast, so that's not that big for that many years. But nonetheless, they're thriving. And what happened is the fire provided an opportunity for the plants to get around by seed. They established, and they have now moved upslope to higher, cooler elevations than they were distributed within Yellowstone prior to the 1988 fires. So the fires plus the climate warming with a seedling reproduction event gave them a chance to expand. So the lodgepole pine regeneration was very abundant with a lot of variation. We also didn't anticipate that. So these pictures are from 15 years post-fire, and we have everything from, so a hectare is about 2.5 acres. I'm sorry, everything's metric, but if you need to convert in your head. We have low densities. This is just natural regeneration. We have medium densities, so over 50,000 trees per hectare, and areas that were up to 400,000 and 500,000 little baby trees per hectare. It was ridiculous. I mean, we just never anticipated that. And our study areas spanned an unknown gradient at that time in serotomy. So lodgepole pine can produce cones that stay on the tree and they remain closed. The seed is safely in there until the cone is heated. And then they release their seeds and they reestablish immediately after the fire. So it's an adaptation to fire. But not all lodgepole pines are serotinous. And so this is what happens with lower densities in areas where that trait is less prevalent, and very high densities where it's more prevalent. And again, we just didn't know that, we knew they were serotinous, but we didn't know there was that much landscape level variation. The second factor is this mosaic. Any of the places where you see those brown colors, those were places where, for a given level of serotomy, you also had the cones is still in the canopy, they were heated, and they shed their seeds, so locally you get these pulses. So we can now go back in, and I can walk through small, dense patches where I know that those were some of these brown halos from 1988. Now, these patterns of tree density are really important from an ecosystem process standpoint because they control things like carbon accumulation, biomass, nitrogen accumulation. So the mosaic of those differences in densities, just the colors here represent different productivity values, above ground productivity of the trees. Point being is that they come in after the fire as a function of serotomy and fire severity, and then they kind of set the stage for what's going to happen to that forest for many decades. They persist for over 150 years. This is work from one of my PhD students, Dan Cashin, and it shows in the top panel the average density of trees at different stand ages, so 50 to 100 to over 300. And then here is a measure of the variation, the coefficient of variation among stands. So that just means at the same age, if the bar is high, there's lots of differences from one place to another, like low density to high density. And then when it lowers down, they even out. So basically, by the time you're at about 200 years, the density stabilizes at about 1,200 trees per hectare, and that doesn't vary much across the landscape. But it means the initial conditions that set up persist for decades to centuries. Nitrogen dynamics. I know that that's a topic that can put many people to sleep, and I'm not going to go into detail on nitrogen, but I just can't resist on some of it. Because most of us, when we've had basic ecology, we were taught the Hubbard Brook nitrogen story, which is you cut the trees and all the nitrogen runs out of the watershed. And they herbicide it as well. They're in very steep terrain and they're in a high nutrient rich environment, but that's what we were expecting as well. We did not see loss. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to stop there and just say, so we have a nitrogen cycle. I'm not going to explain it to you. But following big fires, we didn't know much about what would happen. Most of the work on fire and nitrogen was in prescribed fires like you have in the southeast, or low intensity fires like you have in the southwest. And so what we found is that following fire, those systems did not lose nitrogen. And believe me, we tried to find it. I mean, we sampled it, snow melt, and all this kind of stuff. So they were not losing their nitrogen. When we studied in the field, the microbes were using up more nitrogen than they were producing. And basically, the microbial community in the soil held on to that nitrogen and didn't let it go. That was a surprise. I actually thought our answers were wrong a few times, so we confirmed it. By 15 years, these growing young trees become, we say, a nitrogen sink. They're taking it up and they're saving it in their foliage, and now they're competing very well with the microbes, and again, holding on to the nitrogen in that system. These are very poor soils. They're derived from volcanic sediment, parent material, and so this was also quite surprising. Excuse me. So some of the nitrogen is volatilized following fire. And I don't want to be like the Prime Minister in England. She had a disastrous lecture at the coffee. The signs started falling down behind her. So nitrogen is recovered really quickly. Some of it's volatilized. The black bars here are the live nitrogen pools, so what's in the living trees and the biomass. And by 40 to 70 years, whatever was volatilized is recovered, and we're still trying to figure out where that comes from. So that was the initial stage. I'll give you a little bit of summary of where the fires, the forests were by about 25 years, because we got to resample all of our long-term plots. I didn't expect this to be a long-term study when we started it, but it has been. And just again, some highlights. For the plant community dynamics, I mentioned that the native species recovered quickly. And we found when we were measuring in our plots, the species richness, the number of species that were present, increased a lot for the first 5 years at any one place, but then it leveled out. So again, that was a very quick rebound. The composition was different early on, but there's a lot of what we call an ecological memory. So things that were there previously are still there, and the system kind of recovers in similar way. Without going into too much detail, as we sampled in some of our plots from 1999 to 11 years after fire to 24 years after fire, a large number of plots across the landscape where the lodgepole pine densities varied substantially from those open grown to very dense. We found that even in the very dense ones, species richness of the understory was still increasing. That was opposite to what we expected. We thought there wouldn't be enough light, there wouldn't be enough nutrients, and that they would not have been able to increase, but they were. Early on, it was abiotic conditions that explained what species were where, with a little bit of an effect of burn severity still there. By 2012, however, those lodgepole pines, even though everybody increased, you had more of the pines, you had less species richness. So we see that the trees are starting to exert more control. What the stands looked like after 25 years are shown in these panels. Again, just to give you a sense, height-wise, these are about 2-3 meters in height. So again, much slower growing in 25 years than you would expect for your southern pines. But we still have tremendous variation and just robust, healthy-looking young trees, which we were again surprised to see. They are super productive, like more productive than these young trees should be at this stage. For those of you in the forest ecology side, I did put one number up here. The average AMPP is about 5 micrograms per hectare per year, but it ranges 0 for the trees if we had no trees on the plot, up to over 16, so really high. So if you think about growth rates that happen and as stands are developing, they're sort of hitting the steep part of that curve. And at the ecosystem level, it's driven by stem density still. So individual trees in those high density stands are tiny, so tiny in D by DBH. So if you're a forester, it's not what you want. But if you're trying to sequester carbon, it is what you want, because the more of them you have, even though they're smaller at the ecosystem level, they are still really doing the work. Fuels is another really interesting one, because there's a lot of discussion about whether or not fires that happen, for how long will that self-limit future fires, so when you get fires coming back again. So looking at the fuels development, basically, I think just look at the main, unless you really like fuels, and I know some of you probably do, by the time we're at 25 years, we meet or exceed the fuels that are available in mature forests. So there's plenty of fuel on the ground, and the fuels can support fire. They They can support either high-severity surface fire or active crown fire. So either fires that are going to kill the trees but creep on the ground, or the ones that go from crown to crown. So these guys, even though we had 1 to 300 year fire return intervals, they're good to go. The nitrogen cycling, again, we did a little bit more. I'm just going to touch on it just a bit. We did a lot of work on the nitrogen in the soils, in the litter, and in the foliage, trying to understand where the system is coming from, expecting that we would see evidence for nitrogen limitation given the high growth rates that we're seeing, and we don't. And so looking for it in many different ways, there's no evidence at this point that nitrogen, which is expected to be the limiting nutrient, is limiting the productivity of those lodgepole pines. Their foliar nitrogen is above the critical threshold indicators from the forestry literature, and actually the productivity of the pines and inorganic availability are inversely related, which is not the relationship you would expect if the nutrient was limiting. And as we've looked over time, all of the pools of nitrogen have increased in the system. So as the trees have increased in nitrogen, the soil wasn't depleted, like we're not seeing compensation there. So that's a puzzle that we're working on now. So, 1988 fires, consequences, well studied, wonderful opportunity to understand how systems respond to natural disturbances that are big. And even, this was in National Geographic a year ago, we have a good understanding now of succession following these events. We know, that the trees will start to come in right after, that we have our animals coming back in, we have a well-developed, thriving young forest immediately thereafter. So the bottom line is that native vegetation and ecosystem processes recovered rapidly from those really big severe fires, and I have spent 20 years walking around to giving seminars and talking about just how well Yellowstone is adapted to these fires. So we talk about that as being resilient. So the system is resilient even to things that seemed catastrophic at the time. In terms of when I use the term resilience, some of you may have seen these kinds of diagrams. It's getting a lot of attention now in the ecological community. Thinking about, if we have, imagine that the ball here is Yellowstone, and it's sitting in a cup, and we have fires that push it, and they move the system, they cause it to change, and it goes up the edge of the cup, but it stays in the basin. So it moves around, but it can kind of recover just as it is. So it's basically, when we talk about resilience, it's the capacity of the system to tolerate a disturbance like the big fires without changing qualitatively. And so the system recovers. It's basically your nice disturbance and succession series. But now when we look ahead, we know that climate and fire regimes are all changing. So the first paper that came out in 2006 in Science, so we're just about 11 years since this was published, was the first paper led by Leroy Westerling to relate the occurrence of the large fires in the west and the increase in large fires to more area burned to the changing climate conditions. There's 3 variables that are really important. One is the warmer temperatures. Second is snow melts out earlier in the spring, and that in turn lengthens the fire season. So snow melt is earlier, and you get longer both growing seasons and fire seasons. So this was a landmark paper. And Leroy brought this up to date in a paper that came out just last year, and this is showing the lines are decadal averages. This is the number of large forest fires in the western United States by decade. You can see where 1988 is here. That was our big Yellowstone year. We have had bigger and bigger years since then, and you can see on average this number has been steadily marching up. And this is not debated. So we started thinking about climate change and what that might mean in Yellowstone very early on. So the first paper, I have it snipped out there from Conservation Biology, Bill Rami and I wrote in 1991. And at that point, we were really kind of thinking logically through what would happen if climate changed. We didn't have the methods and the available models and things that we have now. But we did think about the fact that a warmer, drier climate would increase the activity of fire. If we had more fire, on average, it has to reduce the age of the forest across the landscape. And it would probably shift our vegetation communities upslope, because the higher elevations are where it's cooler and wetter. We did a lot of simulation studies through the 1990s and early 2000s using a variety of different kinds of models. I have the hammer here because we hit the system in all different ways. Take the fire frequency and double it. Or, we did all sorts of things. And in all cases, the results suggested that the system was resilient. So in terms of our evidence at that point, we know that the climate and fire have changed in the past and they'll change in the future. We've simulated changes within the historical ranges of variability that we would expect to provide reasonable bounds. The forest recovered. And even the big fires like 1988 were not ecological catastrophes. So again, Yellowstone seems well adapted to warming climate. Or is it? So this figure, Leroy Westerling showed at a conference where both of us were presenting. I was giving a 20-year synopsis of the Yellowstone fires, about how resilient things were. And Leroy was talking about the climate projections. And I like this figure just because it's an easy visual. It shows in red the areas where the drought was really severe during the summer of 1988. And you can see that centered right on Yellowstone. Okay, so that makes sense. And then if you look at the projections for the end of this century, the red is deeper and it's throughout the entire Rocky Mountain forested region. So what he was telling us was that climate, like what we had in 1988, would be the norm, not the exception. And that was a level of magnitude of change that we simply hadn't thought about. We were really sticking within the HRV, so to speak. So Leroy and I and a couple of others started a project to put our methods together and look further at what this would mean for Yellowstone. And so shown here is just, this is time on the bottom. Sorry, I don't have an axis here. And this is just a measure of drought and a measure of temperature during the fire season, the growing season. And so what we're seeing is we're expecting a 4 to 6 degree increase during the spring-summer time period where fires would be likely to occur, and that's associated with increased drought. So we then looked at what that would mean for fire dynamics in Yellowstone. And the figure is a little complicated. This is a log axis over here. And basically, I want you to just look at the trend in this lineup. It's got the median, and it's got the interquartile, and the full range, etc. But the area of the 1988 fires is the lower dotted line, and then all of the Greater Yellowstone vegetated area is here. And by the time we're in mid-century, we're seeing readily conditions where, statistically, if you assume fuels are available, this is an assumption, this is not a prediction of what will happen, it's based on the weather and our relationships between weather and fuel, we would be able to burn much of Yellowstone essentially every year. So this was a much greater potential change than anything we had previously suggested or observed or even considered. And basically, the correct interpretation is that the climate conditions conducive to big fires would occur much more frequently than has occurred in the past 10,000 years. And that's a big difference. I mean, that really fundamentally challenged my understanding of the system and what it might be doing in the future. So years without fire would be rare. Fires eventually would no longer be climate limited. There would have to be a switch to fuel limitation based on what comes back. Fuels would have to eventually limit that, and severity could change, etc. So that left us with, well, geez, if that's what's going to happen, what does that mean for future successional dynamics, for what these forests might be like and what these landscapes would be like in the future? So we know warmer, drier climate will give us more fire activity. That's pretty much, that's fine. But lots of details unresolved. So how many fires, how much area to burn, when will it happen, what will happen, what are the implications for the system? And this is hard to do because even though big fires like this are increasing, we're seeing them every summer, they're still not something you can order up. And by definition, we have few events to study. So I don't have the 1988 fires all the time that I can go to. The other thing is that trees live a long time and they change slowly. So it's hard. You can't just watch the development of the whole system over a century. We need multiple scientific careers to do that. But fires can trigger abrupt change, and they can give a chance for the system to reorganize. Oh, that's interesting. There we go. Wrong button. So what do we do? So I would say, first of all, we do not put our heads in the sand. The ostrich approach won't help. But I think to get at some of these questions about what our landscapes will be like in the future, we're going to need to use sort of all the tools in the toolkit. So we need long-term studies, observations across, a gradient of disturbance, experiments, and also process-based models. We need to look for places where there's nonlinear threshold dynamics in the system where we could get suddenly surprised by what happens. And I think in particular, we need to look at some of the mechanisms that will underpin the changes or how these systems might respond. And so this is what we've been up to as of late. So in terms of the mechanisms, I have focused a lot on the regeneration of the forest after fires, because if we want a system to be resilient and it's a forest, that's a really key step. You don't get to regrow the forest if you can't get the trees back in there. And we have trees that have to come back by seed. So we have been focusing on a couple of different things about warming climate and also changing fire, and thinking about what they might do to the ability of the system, the forest, to come back. So if we increase the frequency of the fire, say the trees haven't had a chance to have cones, we won't have enough seed. If we make the fire size really big, maybe the seed can't get there. And then once it gets there, regardless of how much there is, what if it's really droughty? Not the same year of the fire, but in subsequent years. So we've been exploring these conditions, and I'll walk you through just a little bit. So a lot of this is now either our very recent work or still underway. Some of it just hot off the computer this week. So first of all, increased fire frequency could reduce tree recruitment if reburns happen before the trees are mature. And we know that in the 1988 fires, these are some of the same pictures I've showed you, we had mature forest, lots of pine cones, and we came back with lots and lots of forest. Well, during the summer of 2016, Yellowstone had the largest fire season since 1988. Didn't make much of the news because there were fires burning in other locations where houses and such were. The 2016 fires in Yellowstone did not threaten any communities really or infrastructure, so they kind of flew under the radar. But here, they're reburning some of my study sites. So this is a photo from Park Service, but this is burning in some of the 28-year-old lodgepole pines, those dense areas that we've been studying. So these reburns, I've spent the month of July studying these in Yellowstone. We had NSF rapid funding to go in and ask, what happens when we have these? Because you can't plan for them, and you can't order them up. And so just to give you an idea of what they look like, they're really somewhat different than the others, somewhat similar and somewhat different. So there's still this burn mosaic in the background that you can see. Okay, so that's over here. But then there's a lot of variations. Some of the areas had complete consumption of all the logs on the ground and all the young trees that were standing there. And then other places, like on the side here, had the stand replacing fires that I'm accustomed to seeing, where they kill the trees, but the trees are left behind. So we have been looking, and this is, like I said, these are just back-of-the-envelope calculations because I haven't finished entering all the data, but just to show you a sense of what has happened here. When we reburn the forest before it's matured, in some places we have a pre-fire density. Let me see if I have this right. So we have, following the 1988 fires, I have the density of trees that came back, and then following the 2016 fires. In some places where it wasn't that severe, and there was still some pine cones, we got replacement density. But in areas that looked like this, we had a 98% reduction in how many trees came back after 1988. And then if you reburn it again and consume everything, how many are coming back the second time? So this is one of the data sets I'll be working on with this coming winter. So even within the short interval fires, the fire severity, so this difference, these are the same time periods between fires, that difference in fire severity, I think, is going to play a much greater, more influential role than it did following the 1988 fires, just because of consuming, everything. It was pretty striking. And there are these patches, this is a fairly large one, but they're distributed all throughout those reburns. And I don't know why. The fire behavior people haven't explained it to me either. So if any of you know something about that, like fires can lay down or they can implode. I've heard all sorts of things, and I really don't know. So we can also have changes in the size of fires in the future. So if the tree species are not lodgepole, or they're not serotinous lodgepole, if you don't have a bank of seed in the canopy, when you have a fire, you've got to seed in from the edges. So if the fire patches get so big, then that they exceed the distance of dispersal, then we may have a problem with a resilient forest. Douglas fir is a good example of a species that must seed in from mature living trees on the outside. And following 1988, this is an example where Douglas fir at the top, these are survivors of the 1988 fires, and the reproduction of Douglas fir it declines as you get further away from the surviving trees. Once you get about 100 meters away from survivors, you get almost no Douglas fir regeneration. And that's true for some of the other species that also are non-serotinous. With respect to the post-fire drought and tree establishment, we could, again, once you get the seed there, you still have to have good conditions for the seed to grow. And the tolerances of a mature organism, a big tree, are quite different from the tolerances of a little seedling. It's just like in your garden, you have to baby your little seedlings when they're first coming up. They can't take a day of drought, but the big mature plants can handle maybe a week of drought, and the trees are very much the same thing. So the limits of tolerance vary. The mature trees can persist over a wide range of conditions, and the regenerating trees, or the regeneration niche, is more narrow. So we've done several things on this. This is just a summary of some work that one of my recent graduate students, Brian Harvey, did as part of his research in Yellowstone Grand Tetonic Glacier. Basically, we looked at fires that were stand replacing, that were followed either by several years of wet or several years of dry. And again, you have to, that's all the fires that there were that meant those conditions. And we found fewer trees in the dry post-fire years, and also on south-facing slopes. So those of you who've taken ecology, you know that those are going to be your hot, dry slopes. Your north ones will be warmer and wetter. So we saw the trend within a fire, and then also between fires. And then Winslow Hansen is another current PhD student in my lab. We've done some experimental work, and this is Winslow getting cores out of the soil in recently burned forest, and then planting them in the same place again within the places where lodgepole pine currently grow, and then also taking those cores and moving them down to this area, which is lower elevation, where today's climate matches what is projected by mid-century in the lodgepole pine zone. So we're taking advantage of today's climate to see what will happen, but making sure that we have the right soils from the burned forest, and we've got them contained. And so these data are in a paper. I was actually working on the paper on the plane. No, actually that's a different one, but this is there's two of Winslow's papers that I'm working with him on. But just to show you some of the results, this is a 4-year experimental study, a lot of work, and we have 70 to 90% reduction in the seedling establishment for both lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, so the two different species, at the high elevation and at the low elevation. So the showing that when you have that warmer, drier climate conditions, we do get lower ability of the seeds to establish. So this leads us to the question about, could our forests be in transition? So this is the picture that I showed you just a little bit ago. And what would happen if we have increasing frequency, size, and now I need to add severity of stand replacing fires, pushing that ball, and a warmer climate makes it easier to push the system to another state. So this is more shallow here than it is here. Could we flip some parts of Yellowstone into non-forest, or into woodland, or into aspen? And so this is some of what we're working on now, again on the mechanism side, and then also with some modeling. But show in the future, might we, instead of seeing this amount of forest and this amount of young forest coming back, might we see more open woodland and more non-forest in certain places? And under what conditions might we see that? So another aspect of our current research is asking what makes a landscape resilient. If we think about those mechanisms, we think about the patterns of fire that are out there, and we think about the types of regeneration processes that are necessary, We're working on a project, we're only about a year into it right now, but we have worked on, we've had a workshop with the forest managers. We're reaching out to the Park Service and some Forest Service managers asking what it is they're worried about or what they want to pay attention to in their landscapes in the future. And then using a dynamic spatial simulation model to explore alternative futures. And again, this is kind of challenging as a study question or trying to figure out what these landscapes will be like, because in many cases the models that have been developed in the past have hardwired into them the relationships that we've already observed in the past. And so we need kind of a new generation of models that allow us to go outside, like outside that 10,000 year variation where we weren't even thinking about that. So how do we get our models to behave like that? Because we're looking at conditions where the future may be quite different from what the past is. We also have multiple interacting drivers. It was hard to find the standard placing fires with the warm, the dry, and the cool years afterwards, but yet we're trying to understand what will happen. So we're working in collaboration with a scientist in Vienna, Rupert Seidel, with a model that he developed in the Pacific Northwest. Originally, it's an individual-based model, so trees are represented individually, and we've got all the processes built in. One of my current students has parameterized, meaning we came up with all the things we needed to run the model for our species in Yellowstone. And I'm just showing here some evidence that we have done carefully this process, because this is all current work, none of this is published yet. So this is basal area, and this is the height of the trees for Yellowstone lodgepole pine, and each of the lines is a simulation, starting with real data, and each of the circles is the actual data of scans of different age. So we're in the ballpark pretty well, and we've done a lot of work with that. We've now been trying to explore these mechanisms that I just talked to you about. How would they play out when we combine them all and look at all the possibilities in the future? So Winslow, this is the paper I was working on in the plane. We developed an experiment with the simulation model where we have looked at two of our species, so the Douglas fir that I showed you and then the lodgepole pine that do or do not have those special cones. And then we've looked at the time between fires, everything from the shortest that we've seen in the system to date, up to the shortest from that record since the Holocene, throughout the Holocene. Different distances from seed source, so from 50 meters to a kilometer. And then the historical climate, or the projected climate for the middle of the century, or for the end of century. So we've looked at all those combinations with lots of replication. And I'm just going to show you one summary figure, none of the under the hood stuff. So what is shown here is a three-dimensional figure for where all of those things are. So I'll show you very quickly. The climate periods are on the right here on the X. The fire return interval from 11 to 100 on the Y. And then the distance to seed source on the Z, on the one coming up. The red means the combinations of conditions where regeneration was not successful, and that was a very conservative definition. It had to be less than 50 trees per hectare. So we're not marginal. And the green is where it's successful. So for Douglas fir, distance from seed source is really, really important. So that's why this whole area is red here. And then you get more regeneration failure when it's also warm. So it's an interaction of the fire size and the warmth. For non-serotinous lodgepole pine, it's all about distance. Climate did not have a lot of an effect. Fire return interval doesn't have a lot of an effect on either of those because they don't have serotinous cones. There's not a seed bank. They have to rely on seeding from the outside. And then for the serotinous lodgepole pine, it is all about the fire return interval and whether or not you have those seeds on the site. And now I know it has to be severity as well. It's not just the interval, it's also the severity. So we're looking at all those combinations and trying to figure out how those might play out for the landscape as a whole. This fits within some of our theory about disturbances and succession that goes back a good 20 years, saying that succession will be kind of predictable. We can anticipate well what will happen if we have small patches, low severity and intensity, and low frequency, so the system has recovery time. And it will be less predictable and maybe take us in new directions that we haven't observed in the past when we get big patches, high severity, high frequency. So we sort of reduced that ecological memory that I mentioned was so important for the recovery of the 88 fires. So the bottom line, I would say now, is that the past may not predict the future in Yellowstone, but I think all the work that we did following the 88 fires gives us a benchmark. So if we see differences in the future of post-fire succession, we know what we should have expected, and it's going to be the difference in recovery. Not that the fires happen, they will, but do the systems recover in the same way? The forests in Yellowstone may actually be less resilient with climate warming and with more fire, but I always never want to be pessimistic on this and say Yellowstone's not going to be destroyed. We're still going to have native species, we may have younger forests, we may have changes in the relative abundance of the different forest types, they may be in slightly different places on the landscape, but we will not destroy the system. But I think we'll also have opportunities to observe how it recovers. And I think also focusing in Yellowstone as we are, but also in other systems and the types of questions you might be answering for your forest, focusing on mechanisms is really important because we have to understand the reasons and the underpinnings, and there are things we can often do on a shorter time period. So in sum, I would say one of our challenges as resource managers, as conservation biologists, as ecologists, is anticipating where, when, and why we may have surprises or ecosystem transitions in the future. So I think this is one of our big picture challenges. So thank you very much for coming today, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer questions.
If you ask questions, just speak up so the audience can hear when you ask the question.
I have two, actually. One, typically the Park Service doesn't manage their forests. They let things go naturally. Have there been any studies looking at burned areas that have been manually reseeded rather than just to grow back naturally? The other question is, what happened to insect populations? Do you have any problems with insects and disease after one of these fires?
Okay, so on the first question, in terms of reseeding for this type of system, usually don't have to because they come in naturally. When they have done reseeding, a lot of times they're reseeding with grasses because they're worried about erosion. So they will often assume that the trees will come back and they'll reseed with grasses, and that will often have a negative effect on the native understory species. So there is lots of information on that. They do sometimes plant after clear cutting, and they do clear cut out there. It is an appropriate strategy there, as long as just because the system is adapted to the standard placing fires. In terms of the insect population, so I did not talk about that for lack of time, but we've also done a lot of work on mountain pine beetle outbreaks out west. That has, throughout the 2000s, so mountain pine beetles are native insects in Yellowstone. They're phloem feeders, so they're bark beetles. They grow, they go in and underneath, and the females lay their J-shaped galleries, and the young come out and girdle the tree. So they outbreak in the decadal time scale in Yellowstone, and the concern that came up in recent years has been, well, these beetles are out there killing trees. That's going to raise the risk of fire. So we were working on that question, but also a lot of other fundamentals on it. The answer is that the beetles do not increase the risk of fire. They are actually reducing the canopy fuels. This is a crown fire system. When they come in, it takes about 4 years for the trees that will be killed to die. The effect of them, I think, is visually much more striking to us because it's the large trees that are attacked. The small trees that are the saplings or the suppressed, we say advanced regeneration because they're just waiting to go. They're not eaten by the bark beetles, and there's no effect on the understory or the soils other than indirect from the needles coming down. But then you're shedding the needles, and so you've reduced the canopy fuels substantially. They will still burn. And many of the studies that have said, oh, it's burning an old beetle kill forest, it is, but they haven't asked if it's burning differently than it would have if there was no beetle kill. So watch for that when you see it in the news. One of the other things that we think is an interesting interaction between the densities of trees that come back and the future outbreaks to beetles is that difference in the density leads to differences in how soon a tree reaches a susceptible size to a beetle. So if you're in an open ground stand, those trees become susceptible sooner. If you're in the dense stand, it takes, could be 40 or 50 more years before those trees are big enough. So we think, we actually have a modeling paper that came out last year. It's not empirical, but it suggests that that density has a benefit of dampening the risk of the forest to the future beetle outbreaks. And I think this is, again, another example of having the unmanaged forest to see what happens and learn those consequences. In terms of other consequences for insects, I'm not aware of anything else that was pathogenic or anything. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer. I feel like I could give a little mini lecture after the lecture. Anything else? It's late in the day, I know. Yes?
Is there like management strategies that could help make these systems more resilient? Like we're talking about unmanaged systems again. You know, in a managed system, is there anything else like what to do?
So the question was, are there management strategies that can help make these forests more resilient? That's a really good question. One of the very important things is maintaining that mosaic-y pattern, that heterogeneity in the landscape. There are times when fire crews come in, hotshot crews come in from other places, and if the fire has burned, they will go in and burn out those green islands because they're afraid they're going to start up again, and they'll produce embers that can be lofted, and the fire will just start spotting again. We've had them do that even in Yellowstone, because the local parks, they relinquish control for firefighting once it gets to a certain level. Some of you probably know that better than I. So making sure that we have that heterogeneity in the landscape is actually really important for the seed trees and for just breaking up some of the fuels and the like. In areas that are not national park and wilderness areas, so on national forests where we have a multiple use mandate and we're not just doing the let nature take its course, there has been quite a bit of discussion about whether to plant species that might be more suitable for the climate that is anticipated. And so I will be very curious to hear from the forest managers we met with in Missoula. We met in February before this fire season and see what they're thinking, because they're a native species, like ponderosa pine is in that vicinity. That would be one that can come in drier places. So maybe you would be planting ponderosa if you're thinking about harvesting and not going back for Engelmann spruce or not lodgepole. So so those are things that are being discussed that I think could end up being important. The other thing is I think we have to minimize additional stresses on these systems. So if we know they're going to be facing more fire and warmer temperatures, we need to be careful about some of the invasives that are coming in and really watch some of that. In dry areas outside Yellowstone, cheatgrass is coming in following the 2008 gun barrel fire. It's a very, very dry area. It's coming in from the roadsides and working its way up. And so I think we need to try to minimize, to the degree that we can, some of the other threats to the system. And of course, we need to deal with climate change. Yes?
I want to just ask a question about the serotinous cones on the lodgepole pine. So that seems curious that some have them and some don't. Does an individual tree have some of each? Or are there stands of trees that have them and the other stands don't? How does that work?
Yes and yes is what we're learning. So I'm really interested in that as well. So what we have known previously is a space for time analysis. So one of my former students, Tanya Chernago, looked at lodgepoles of all different age, and then at different elevations, because we were trying to understand this. And at high elevations, there just isn't serotiny, and those are places where the fire return interval is about 300 years, just under it. So I was telling the undergraduate class this morning, it's kind of like you're going to die of old age, most likely, rather than be killed by a fire. So selection should act to give you cones that release their seeds each year, because there's a chance, you'll have a tip-up mound, something will happen, maybe it's a beetle outbreak or something like that. At the lower elevations, the fire return interval is about 180 years, so you're much more likely to die by fire than to live to old age. And that's where serotiny is most prevalent, but it's still not 100%. On average, it's about 60%. So if I was in a stand, and I scored my trees, most of them would be there, but not all. And there is a seed predator, red squirrels, prey on serotinous cones, serotinous trees. And so I suspect there must be a trade-off there that I don't fully understand. So Craig Bankman at Wyoming and Matt Toludo have done work on that. And so I think that there's some kind of dueling selection pressures that are maintaining both in the population. The genetics haven't been done yet. I think it'd be a great PhD topic for someone who wanted to take that on. We wanted to do the genetics of lodgepole back in the 90s, and the forest geneticists warned us off. They said it wasn't possible, so we did it on aspen instead. But I don't think anybody's ever done it. But it's a really interesting strategy. And then the other thing that I wonder is, why the heck is a tree putting out seed to make 500,000 stems per hectare? I mean, that's overkill that you just don't need. But maybe if you have an unpredictable environment, even if you lose 80% of your seed, you'll still regrow your forest stand. So maybe it's also a way to account for environmental variability. So yes, good question. I still have many questions as well. Yes?
You showed a slide and you said you were very surprised to see an aspen growing from the seed. Well, I thought aspens grew like root systems for hundreds of acres.
Yeah. And so the question was, I showed the slide of the aspen and said that I was surprised to see that it was from seed, and that don't aspen grow from their roots, from their underground rhizome structures. They do. They absolutely do that, and that's why we were told, and I was trained as a graduate student, that the aspen are only reproducing new tree-sized stems by sprouting. They're called ramets. They send up new ramets from their roots. And that each of the individual aspen groves that we see in Yellowstone are an individual plant, and it could have been there for thousands of years, even though the tree stem is there. And that the conditions for reproducing by seed in the Northern Rockies, the climate was no longer suitable, so that they probably established at a time in the past when it was suitable, and then they can hang on. So that's why we were really surprised, because we misidentified them the first year, and the next year they were woody, and they keyed out to be aspen. We're like, nope, they can't be aspen, because they don't do that. They were still aspen every time we keep them out. And so it appears that they have both strategies. So once they're established, yes, they can hold on to a site, and they do send up ramets and reproduce clonally. But aspen produce seed. They set seed and grow in by seed in Wisconsin, up where I am. It's actually a very flexible tree. It is the most widely distributed tree in North America. And I think if you can do both of those things, it gives you a big edge, because you can send your seeds out periodically, and that gives you the chance to move around the landscape and find new places, particularly if the environment is changing. And then once you're there, you can really hold on by having that ability to resprout. One of the things that we think, and I didn't talk about this, again, there's just so much to talk about in so little time. But in these places where we had the reburns, the aspen are so interesting because they came in from seed after the 1988 fire, and now a second fire came in and took out their competitive lodgepole pines. So we think the aspen are going to benefit from that. And so they may now have an edge, they've got roots developed, they should be able to resprout, and that may be enough to allow them to really hold on. I don't know what will happen, but we did still see them coming in after the fires. So yeah, who'd have thought aspen would be so interesting? Yes?
Fantastic talk, really enjoyed it. And I also want to say this emphasizes the importance of long-term studies in single places. I think it's really amazing. But what I'm curious about, we talked about the natural variation in the fire cycles over the past 10,000 years, but the region also had Native American populations.
Had what?
The region had Native American populations, right? So I'm curious about the interaction between people and the forest and these fire regimes before the recent research.
Yeah, really. So the question is, what about the influence of Native Americans? Because there were people living in these areas as well throughout this time period. So from what we know from the anthropologists and the archaeologists that have studied in that region, the Yellowstone region, because the climate is so severe, that it was not a location where there were permanent settlements. So the people would go up and use, they would get obsidian for arrowheads, and they would considered a lot of the thermal areas and such sacred, some of the mountains that have steam and they were coming out there. But they think that they were used infrequently and only sporadically. And so there, as far as we can tell, and from the pollen record and what others have done, this is not my area, the thought is that still, even if there were fires, it would have only, if they were big fires, if they were ignited by humans, whether it was people or lightning, it would still only have been in the seasons where you have the very severe weather. So, yeah, good question. Yes, Chris?
Well, one more question. Does anybody else have one more question? Last question.